Anyway, my name is Pietro Mascolo, and today I'm going to talk to you about, I don't know, I have no clue what my model is doing, so we're going to have a look at how we can evaluate models, machine learning models in production environments when the situation tends to be a bit more complex than what we've been led to believe when we were training as data scientists. So first, just a couple of words about myself. I come from a very multicultural, cosmopolitan environment, as you can see from the number of flags in my intro. I'm a husband and a dad, physicist, so a bit crazy. I'm a pragmatic data scientist. I try to make sense of the world around me, and I try to make sure that we can extract value from our models, not just results. A few other things, nothing very important. The most important, I think, is that I am a dedicated nerd. I enjoy technology, I enjoy nerdy things, and I hope that I can share some of my pain points and passion for what I've seen through my years as a data scientist with you today. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to have a look at real-world situations in terms of evaluating machine learning models, what can happen, what can go wrong, what we can do about it. And there are many things that can go wrong. I'm going to go through it by degrees. We'll start from a very simple situation, and we'll gradually increase the level of complexity that we deal with. So why are we here? Well, we're here because when you're training as a data scientist, you get used to seeing situations where you train your model, then you have your test set, you just check that your labels in your test set match the labels that your model has predicted, and that's grand. And that tends to be what companies expect, what your project manager might expect. They might expect you to just import and use that magical function that loads your data and that magical second function that loads the labels, and then you can just compare them, and that's it. That's all the evaluation, what evaluation is about, right? Well, it turns out that in real life, sometimes, like very often, we don't have those magical functions. So we might have no clue as to what the model is doing. Forget about how well it's doing it. We might not know what it's doing at all. We might not even have ground truths. We might not know what the real value of our labels is. So what do we do at this point? Just a bit of a disclaimer here. I'm going to use accuracy as metric throughout the presentation. I know it's a terrible metric in a lot of circumstances. I'm just using this for the sake of simplicity because it's easy to understand and everybody can grasp the concept of it. So, as I mentioned, the situation is we have our model result, we know the labels for those results, and we know what metric we're interested in, or at least the one that the business wants to hear about, or your CEO or your CTO or whoever. Well, great, that's fantastic. That's the ideal situation. You can just import your metric, calculate it, and that's it, right? That's boring, also unrealistic. So let's try to add a bit of realism to this situation. So for example, let's say that we don't have all the model's result. We still have the ground truth, but we can only see some of the model's outcomes. So what can we do about this? And I apologize already. We're going to start the first of two very small mathematical interludes. I'll keep them as brief as possible. I will omit a lot of things. So if you're familiar with the concept, fantastic. You will see that I'm omitting a lot of things, forgetting things, and not talking about other things. If you're not familiar with them, great. I'll try to give them to you in the briefest time possible. And the first concept we're going to have a look at is the central limit theorem, right? We're not going to go through the mathematical formulation or anything. Suffice to say that what this theorem is, it's one of the fundamental theorems in statistics, is that if you have an underlying distribution of data, it doesn't matter what it looks like. If you take enough samples of sufficient size out of that underlying distribution, then the distribution of your samples will be a normal distribution, and its mean and standard deviation will be linked to the underlying distribution of the data. Now, let's not quibble about what enough samples and sufficient size mean. We'll leave that to the side. There are some rules of thumb that you can use to determine appropriate numbers. But how can we use this in terms of using it to calculate how our model is doing? Well, if we have enough data, right, suppose that we have hundreds of thousands of data points, what we can do is, in this case, for example, I'm taking 200 samples of 100 points each from the underlying distribution, and these samples are supposed to be random, right? We take all these samples, we collect the metrics for all these samples together, and then from that collection of metrics, we can extract, not extrapolate, the mean, standard deviation, and those will reflect what's in the underlying distribution. In our case here, we can estimate what the underlying model's accuracy is. It's not perfect because we don't know what the shape of that distribution is, but it's much better than nothing. This is the case in which we have enough data. What if we don't? What if say we have only 100 points to go by? Well, there's another technique that's very similar to it, and it's called bootstrapping. And it works alongside the same principle. It's just that this time, instead of running the same sampling process over multiple times with many different data points, we extract the same length of the points that we have. So we have 100 points. We will extract a number of samples of 100 points with replacement. And for those of you who are not familiar with this concept, with replacement means that every time we extract a random value from our black bag of values, we immediately put it back in. So we can extract the same value multiple times. And essentially, after this sampling process where we sample the same length of what we have with replacement, we can go back to the previous case and the rest follows in exactly the same way. And again, we're ignoring what the underlying shape of the distribution is, but it's kind of okay. We just need to know that we have the mean of the underlying distribution. We know that the parameter we are evaluating is normally distributed, so with the standard deviation, we can also estimate confidence bounds. All right, so that was reasonably easy. What about a bit more realism? This is going to get ludicrous, let me tell you. Okay, what if we additionally don't have any information as to what the ground truth is? I'll give you an example. I was working a few years ago, I was working in e-commerce, and we were classifying products for international transactions, right? Because the ultimate aim was detecting understanding what the product is so that we could calculate customs and duties. Problem here is we didn't know whether the model was right or wrong. The classification for this sort of problems is very complex, and the only way we could get results from the production environment was if at a certain point a customs official would examine one of our shipping products, detected it was wrong for some reason, and not necessarily just wrong, because different products might have the same duty rate. So they might say, oh, this is wrong, but no, the monetary value is correct, the duty rate is correct, so kind of who cares? We might never find out about it. So we would find out about only a subset of the errors many weeks later. So we couldn't use them directly to evaluate our model. So, I mean, it's still possible. We can still do something about it. Here we are going to talk about our second mathematical interlude. I will keep it as brief as possible. Apologies again. What we can leverage here is something called inferential statistics, specifically Bayesian statistics, which, as you can imagine, is based on Bayes' rule. Has anybody here never seen this before? Yay, okay, we all have seen it. But very good. So essentially, we're trying to calculate the probability of a parameter given the data that we're seeing. And to do that, we need to know what is the probability of the data that we see given the parameter, which is essentially counting. We need to know a prior distribution of the parameter, so what we expect the parameter to look like. And probability of data is essentially a normalizing constant. We'll ignore it for now. We shouldn't, but for our purposes, we don't want to go too deep into this pit. So then I'm going to talk to you about two other probability distributions. The first of which is, and the most important of which, is the binomial distribution, which describes the number of successes in a series of Bernoulli trials given a certain number of trials. Essentially, a Bernoulli trial is a yes or no process with a certain probability. We are making assumptions here, right? We're assuming that the probability of success, accuracy in our case, of our model for each transaction is the same, which it's clearly not. But we'll ignore that for now. So if we think of our model making classifications, making predictions as a series of Bernoulli trials, yes, no, with the same probability, a collection of those makes up a binomial distribution, and we know how to treat that. The second distribution I'm going to talk about, it's called a beta distribution. I'm not going to talk too much about this. It's harder to put this into a physical perspective and to what might represent in the real world. Suffice to say that it's very convenient. It's a very convenient distribution because based on those alpha and beta parameters, it can assume many different shapes. And it has a very interesting property. The beta distribution is the conjugate prior of the binomial distribution, and that's what we're going to leverage. What that means is if we take our Bayes rule, we're going to ignore the normalizing constant, and we're just looking at what the curve is supposed to do, the distribution is supposed to do. And we plug in our binomial distribution for the process itself, so the probability of data given theta. And we plug in our beta as our prior for the probability of theta. What happens is, if we do the calculation, is that we come up with a distribution that, if you look at it, the last line, it really looks like another beta. And in fact, it is. It is a beta of updated parameters. And that's the beautiful, the beauty of conjugate prior. So if you use the conjugate prior of a distribution as the prior, then your posterior distribution will be a distribution of the same type. And that's what we're going to leverage. In our case specifically here, if we update after a certain number of success and trials, our new posterior distribution is essentially a beta whose parameters have been updated by k, which is the number of successes that we've seen, and n minus k, which is the number of failures. So in practice, we can just set up our prior. Let's say that we don't know anything about the system, and we start with the beta where alpha is equal to 1 and beta is equal to 1, which is a uniform distribution. If you remember the equation, plug in those values, you get a constant. We can count from a manual process. We can take a random sample of classifications that a model made, and we can check manually whether we're correct or not. And we can count those number of successes as number of failures, and we can just update our posterior alpha and beta for the new posterior distribution. And then we can very easily calculate what the distribution is like. We can calculate its moments, we can calculate its standard deviation, and we can just use that as an estimate for the accuracy. And we can do this repeatedly. So if you do this, if you start, for example, with a beta of 1, which is a uniform, you can do this every day with a certain number of random samples of the classifications, and you can keep updating your posterior distribution with each evidence you find every day. Don't do this for too long, otherwise your posterior will be too biased toward the past. Like if you have a model that behaves wonderfully for a month and then does horribly for 2 days, you will not really see that huge shift. So you need to reset your expectations from time to time. All right, let's add a bit more realism. What happens if we don't even know what we should report about? This happens a lot, actually. I was recently working in healthcare, and we were working on a few clinical models. And the most important thing that came out of that project is the fact that we should have really considered not just the metrics per se, but also the cost of our errors. And this is not a simple situation. And the cost of errors is not purely monetary value. It could be something else. Like, for example, as I mentioned in healthcare, the project I was working on aimed at calculating the risk for patients to develop the next stage of a chronic disease. And there is a monetary value intrinsic to that, because you need to intervene on the patients, you need to make sure that the patient takes their medication, and so on and so forth. But there's also a detriment in their quality of life. And you can't put that into money. And we also had a similar project where the condition was much simpler and the detriment was not really there. And what we ended up doing was talking to the business, and it's like, okay, what's the cost of the patient developing this? Oh, they have to go to the doctor every month. Okay. What's the cost of the intervention? What's the intervention we can make? Oh, the intervention we'd make is sending a flyer to the patients. Just send a flyer to everybody. It would be cheaper than working on the model. Okay, more realism. Okay, this is where we were a moment ago, right? But I mentioned the situation in working in clinical domain where the project I mentioned, detecting and determining the risk for patients to develop a certain condition, this was actually a model supposed to go in front of clinicians while they were talking to the patients. So what happens there? We can't really trust our training data, first of all, right? And we need to make sure that we can build that trust. Otherwise, we can't, like, all that data comes from human beings. It's not automatically generated. There will be mistakes in the data. There will be errors in how it's collected. There will be errors in how it's reported. There are things you can do about it, but we're getting really in the realm of very complex interventions. So you could, for example, use an external validator an external model to check which parts of your data may be mislabeled. You can look at the underlying distribution of the data to see if you have any outliers with respect to what you expect. You could turn your problem into a positive unlabeled type of problem, especially, well, not especially, if you have a classification problem. You could check the mean shift variation of the interdistribution clusters if you're working on regression or something like that. But we're not going to go into that also because I think I have 5 minutes left. So, okay, again, back to the idea of clinical trials and clinical projects. We are still in the same situation, but at this point, predictions affect outcomes. If a doctor sees that the patient is at risk of developing something, they will take action. And that will very likely change what will happen in the future. So how do we determine that the model was right? Because we can't collect the outcome. At best, we can collect the intervention. Well, this was me when that happened 6 months ago. And at this point, I have to say, you really have to trust your SMEs. There are processes in place for this sort of things. And in general, I can't really tell you what to do here. You have to figure it out. Trust, as I mentioned, trust your SMEs. Understand the business, understand the domain, understand the cost of interventions and making mistakes. Okay, to sum up, I think I'm still in time. Oh, okay. So the real world is complex. It's way more complex than what we think. It's way more complex than what we would like to think. We can't limit ourselves to just training and test sets. Often there is no way to directly calculate performance of our models, and we have to rely on methods to estimate it. These methods might be, some are good, some are less good, but it depends on your situation. We need to go beyond simple metrics and consider the cost of errors. And again, cost is not just monetary value. It's what is the impact of making a mistake. You need to build trust in your data, because every data set I've ever worked with in the real world has some problems. Even if you don't think they have it, they're there. So go through it, understand it as well as you can, and fix all the mistakes and errors. Re-examine your labels. And trust your SMEs. Okay, I think we actually have a few extra minutes for questions. Thank you very much for enduring me.
Thank you. Very nice talk, Marco. Okay, we have right now one question, Slido, and that is, were you always able to deliver value with a model despite extreme realism?
No. It's unfortunately not always possible in the sense that I described it. Although, if you look at it, sometimes delivering value could lie in the fact that you realize that something cannot be done at this point in time with the tools that we have or with the data that we have. In general, it's also a matter of how you define value. And depending on your domain, value could be merely tied to savings or revenue generation, or it could be tied to outcomes. In our case, for example, when I was working in clinical, we were not really focused just on the cost. We were focused on improving patients' situation. So if you could detect correctly that a patient was at risk of developing something, that was value, inherently. Unfortunately, though, no, it's not always possible to generate value from your models.
Thank you. If there is some question in the audience, we can take it. Sure.
Yes, thanks for the talk. You talked about estimating the cost and benefits, right? Which is a thing people advise to do up front and think, and it's an ongoing discussion. But what's your method for getting these numbers with your SMEs? So you don't have cost, so it's not just money, but it's also making user experience or impact on the patient. Like, but how do you get to like false positive is factor 60 and the other one is 2 or whatever?
Well, this goes back to the idea. Sorry, let me just repeat the last bit so that the camera can also pick it up. So, the question was related to how do you determine the actual cost or the actual value intrinsically related to type 1 versus type 2 error. And well, that is very domain specific. I'll go back again to trust your SMEs to build up the base of your domain knowledge. And then verify with what kind of interventions you can take. So any cost that is associated with an error should be tied to any type of intervention you can take. So if you make a type 2 error, what can you do about it? Or what happens if you make that error, right? Does it lead to, or type 1, doesn't matter really, does it lead to a loss in revenue? Does it lead to having to take on extra actions that will cost money and time? Does it lead to someone losing something, whatever that is, and how to tie that directly to monetary value? Well, I can't help you with everything there. There are some things that are very difficult to calculate. In terms of actions and interventions, well, that's easy. You just verify what you would bill the patient, for example, or what the cost of man hours that you're putting into the interventions are, or the cost of equipment or the process itself. In terms of, for example, in the case that I mentioned earlier, the case of a patient losing, I don't know, a limb or having to go through surgery, well, those risks are harder to quantify, and it depends on your domain. Thank you.
Other questions? I do have a question maybe. So in the list you put at the end, so there are a few things that I actually need to check. Let's say, to me the first, maybe the most important things are the last one. So trust your data and examine your labels. So data quality, I think it's one of. So when you have like results you don't expect, who is the first culprit or the first scapegoat do you think it's like the reason why you don't get the result you expect?
From experience. So usually the main culprits I can think of, well, there's two. One would be me. I made a mistake in coding the pipeline, which, you know, we're humans. We make mistakes. We write bugs. That happens. The second problem that I find the most often is data quality issues. And it could be related to the data acquisition pipeline. It could be related to the data processing pipeline. In my case, specifically, I worked a lot with healthcare providers and insurance providers that have been around for decades. And they've been acquired other companies over time, and they've merged multiple systems over time. So you would find a lot of inconsistencies in the data, a lot of plain mistakes, and those are not always easy to reconcile. Sometimes you actually have to just go with the data that you know you can trust, or at least trust to a certain degree. Yeah, that's my experience.
Thanks for the talk. Just a quick question. Do you have any, other examples of methods of statistical estimation for performance? You mentioned a few with the mathematical interludes. Do you have other examples?
Well, yeah, I mentioned some of the ones I've used in the past, the ones that are more common. Like I've used this extensively for other projects, so I thought this would be the most interesting examples. In terms of statistical estimation and inferential statistics, there's a slew of distributions you can look at depending on your process. That's the important thing. I use the binomial because my process could be described as a binomial. You should try to find the distribution or the equation or the process or the model that best describes your process. And based on that, then you can calculate everything else. In terms of other situations, well, a few things you could consider is using plain other tools, especially in the case where you're not sure about the your data quality. There are libraries that can help you with that. There's plenty of libraries in Python, for example, that deal with positive and unlabeled data sets. If you're working classification, there's plenty of data dimensionality reduction techniques you can leverage. I'm thinking specifically of UMAP that tends to work really well with this sort of problems, try to figure out whether a data point belongs to a certain cluster or not. You could use t-SNE, but t-SNE is a bit more leaning towards pure visualization than actual computation after you calculate your manifold. Yeah, that's the most I can think. We can have a chat after this if you want and try to set it out.
Okay, great. I think we have no time left.
Okay.
So thank you, Marco.
Thank you all.